Welcome to the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. My guest this week is Zoe Sayetta. Zoe is a climbing coach with a master's degree in sport and performance psychology. In this episode, we talk about Zoe's coaching background and her team Matrix, the differences in mental performance between outdoor and competition climbing, execution pressure, awareness and mindfulness, visualization or motor imagery as it's called, optimal zone of performance, how Zoe thinks about flash attempts and her language for failure. I thought that was really interesting. Managing expectations, self-belief, self-talk, redefining success, the importance of focusing on the right thing at the right time. We go through some basic advice if you're new to working on your mindset for climbing. This is pretty much a bird's eye view of many of the most important topics in mental performance in rock climbing. So I hope you find it useful. I'm pretty excited to have this be the second episode of the podcast and the first official episode with a guest. So without further ado, Zoe Sayetta.
What's the podcast called?
Inner Fire Climbing Podcast.
Inner Fire. That's a great name.
Thanks. Yeah, I got kind of lucky because my last name is cool. So
Yeah, you really did.
you are you're the first official guest. So welcome
Woo!
to the show, Zoe Sayetta, right?
Sayetta, yes.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. I'm super stoked to be here and nerd out about coaching.
Yeah. So I guess why don't we dive in there? Give the people your background on climbing and coaching and your education.
Yeah. So I have been coaching for my entire adult life since I was 16 years old. I started coaching competitive gymnastics, and I did that for about 10 years and then transitioned into coaching rock climbing, which now I've been doing for almost 10 years as well, and been climbing for about the same amount of time that I've been coaching climbing. Early on in my climbing career, I had like a pretty serious shoulder injury that kept me out of the sport for close to 2 years, actually. But during that time, I got really deep into the coaching and my love for the sport kind of grew even more. And that's kind of what has kicked off my current setup of the mental performance coaching and the in-person coaching. And my education, my bachelor's degree is in kinesiology, so sports science stuff. And
Cool.
Then my master's degree is in sport and performance psychology.
That's cool. I didn't know that you had a kinesiology, like a physical degree, backing up the psychology degree too. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's a great foundation.
Yeah. Do you feel like that early injury taking you out of the sport personally, like affected the way that you interact with the people that you coach at all? Because you couldn't you're not obviously participating in a physical capacity as much, which I know isn't always a part of coaching necessarily, but do you feel like that messed with your coaching at all?
I think it made it better. So coming from a background of gymnastics coaching, I'm not sure if you are familiar at all, but most gymnastics coaches retire like long before they become coaches and cannot do a single skill that they're teaching their athletes. So I was pretty accustomed to that framework of being kind of sidelined while coaching. I think the way that it changed how I interact with my athletes is when I first started climbing, I think I carried in with me a lot of expectations for performance, and a lot of social comparison, in the beginning phases of my climbing journey. And then being sidelined, I really got to see what really matters and connect with what I really value in the sport, which is effort. And effort does not always equate to, high performance. Hopefully it does sometimes, and a lot of times it does. But no, I think that it helped to ground me in my values more than anything.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think you mentioned you just had a recent injury and a recent surgery as well, right?
Yeah, it wasn't an injury, but coming back from any kind of surgery is definitely the reentry to sport is a task.
Yeah. I feel like I've gotten a lot of mileage in my coaching that I didn't expect out of adversity to injury being something that I present really clearly, because I think there's sort of this perspective that because a lot of elite climbers don't get injured, that's like the standard that we should hold ourselves to, and that like climbers should just expect that they, are going to do some amount of training that makes them invincible and then they won't get hurt anymore. But actually, like if you're a normal person and you take on risk and you started climbing as an adult, like, and you try hard, you're going to get injured. So I've gotten a good amount of mileage and credibility, I think, out of the fact that I get hurt and I recover from it and I come back. And yeah, because it's like you said, effort is such an important part of the sport.
And intention. And I think that like when you're sidelined, you have nothing to do but think about how to be more intentional in the reentry process. And yeah, I've actually had like 7 surgeries over the last 8 years for various things. And every time I come back, I feel part frustration, but also part gratitude for that additional intention that I bring into it.
Yeah. That's great. So tell me about Team Matrix. That's your team now that you coach.
Yeah. So Team Matrix got off the ground in September of this year, or of 2024. And we are an independent hybrid competitive program. So we compete on the Youth USA climbing circuit. But unlike most current competitive programs, we're not affiliated with one of the larger gyms. We rent space from a couple of different independent gyms in the area, as well as a lifting gym. And I write programming individually for each of the athletes on the team. They carry out that program either in pairs or in small pods. And then we meet once or twice a month for our climbing practices and once a week for our lifting practices.
Cool. And so you're involved in, like, would you say you're largely involved in the mindset work? Do you help them like organize what kind of technical stuff they're going to work on? You write lifting for them. You're kind of like doing all of this stuff for these athletes. I'm just trying to give my audience a picture. Yeah,
totally. I do all of it for Team Matrix. So I would say that my coaching is heavily informed by my mental performance practice. And so it's difficult to separate that piece of things from all of the programming that I write for them. But yes, they have a physical training program. They have technique work, drills, all of the above.
Yeah. So I feel like you're very steeped in this like indoor competition world, because you like work with a lot of kids and competitive climbers, and you have a lot of background as like a head coach and stuff. And I'm like very in this outdoor performance world. I'm probably like maybe the most outdoor skewed coach out of all the coaches out there. So I'm curious from your perspective. I brought you on this podcast because I heard you say some things about mental performance, and they really rung true for me, even though it's a totally different world. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like what things might be the same between like a competition environment and what things might be like different, competition environment versus climbing outside and trying to like send a project or flash a boulder or a route outside.
Yeah. I think that probably the biggest differences are in the indoor or competition context. The climbs disappear at a certain point and you no longer have access to them. And so I think that maybe there's an element of the indoor climbers' experience that makes it more difficult for them to engage in like long-term projecting or to really kind of withstand or be resilient to the frustration that comes with that long of a process, which I think is, something that outdoor climbers are pretty accustomed to and comfortable with. So I think that's maybe one of the biggest differences. But I think the similarities are anytime you are putting yourself in a performance context where you're trying to achieve a goal that is important to you, there is going to be pressure and there are going to be stakes. And so those cognitive and physiological symptoms that you get based on that pressure, I think are pretty lateralizable.
Yeah, pretty similar from area to area. I like that phrase, lateralizable.
I think so.
Yeah. Do you work with your, I guess I'm sure you do, but do you work with your clients on like execution pressure in like a direct way Are they doing some execution pressure type drills or type performance in every session? Or is that something that you reserve for like, we're working on technical skills and building up strength, and then we like do a block of that kind of thing before a competition? Or how do you think about training people for that?
It's really individual, I would say. I think that there are some athletes who struggle with it a little bit more than others, and in which case I will embed it into their programming on an ongoing basis. And then there are athletes who it doesn't seem quite as big of a mental crux for them. And therefore I'll usually just kind of make a block of it ahead of a competition.
Right. So you can kind of focus on getting them in shape, and they're going to do what they need to do to work on their whole getting in the zone psychological framework thing, like right before the comp kind of.
Yeah. And I think that it manifests just really differently for each different athlete. I think that, there are athletes that present as very cool and collected. But then when they have a performance that doesn't meet their expectations or doesn't meet their goals, you do have to kind of step back and say, okay, well, were you maybe nervous? Did that maybe surface in a way that you are just unfamiliar with or not ready to acknowledge? And then my job is to kind of like parse through that and understand what those patterns are, and then therefore how we can address them.
Yeah, I would give myself like a lot of different job titles, or I wear a lot of hats being the coach that I am. And like a few times I've used the word detective, because I feel like in order to like really get a full picture of a climber, when you're, I'm basically beholden to their self-reporting. So I have to like find the right questions and ask them to send me the right videos and stuff to like get a true picture, because like you said, some people will kind of present one face to the world, but they're holding those things in because it feels very vulnerable to share those things. So they might not want to present that stuff even to a coach, especially if they've just met that coach. So that can be tricky.
Well, and I think it's not only that they don't want to present it to the coach. I think a lot of times they're not aware of it in themselves. I think that some of the hardest work that the athletes I work with have to do is the introspection required to really like untangle what is actually holding me back. And is it things that I wasn't currently aware of?
Is that mostly like conversational, that process?
Yeah, and I think reflective. I have them do a lot of journaling and a lot of like peer debriefing. So I'll partner them up and they'll kind of debrief their mental state or what they feel like went wrong. And I find the conversational stuff amongst the peers can be really beneficial.
So let's say you are working with a client and you find that they, can do really well in some certain environments, but they just have a hard time getting into like fifth gear, when it's like time to like fully try hard. Like they can do really well in practice. Maybe they even do really well in like some mock comps in the right scenario. But if you like put them in a competition or full competition environment, or even a practice environment, but they have like, parents are there or other kids or, that they find intimidating or whatever. How do you work with those kids to like get them to be able to really shift into high gear, to really like get in the zone kind of on command?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of identifying triggers. What are the things that are kind of activating these negative spirals in your head? And then what tools and skills can we use to either mitigate those spirals or distract from them? So
it's almost like CBT kind of when you say spirals.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So oftentimes what happens is, an athlete will enter into a performance scenario with a certain expectation, right? And then along the way, something happens that is not in line with their expectation, right? And that's kind of usually the trigger for the thought spirals, which are, oh crap, like I'm not as good as I thought I was. I didn't do this thing that I thought I was going to do, or surely I'm not going to advance to the next round. And then that just kicks off the loop, right? And so,
not focusing on the task at hand.
Exactly. Not focusing on the right thing at the right time. And so the goal there is to know what are those expectations or, scenarios that can kick off those loops, and how can we practice having a different response to them than we ordinarily would. And imagery is one of the ways that I like to do that the most.
Okay. So like visualization.
Yeah. So I like to have my clients use imagery or visualization to practice the responses that they would want to have in a high pressure scenario, right? So let's say a trigger occurred and they begin the loop. They have to become aware that the loop is occurring, right? And then kind of deploy whatever methods they have come up with to get out of it. And if you can get reps in doing that in your mind, then when the actual scenario manifests, it's just a lot easier to do the thing that you want to do rather than the thing that you are used to doing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, the thing that springs to mind for me is like a lot of the time if a client is having a hard time with frustration or having a hard time with other like negative emotions that they might experience while climbing, we'll start with just every time they go to pull onto the wall or every time they touch their chalk bag, just like a mental check-in of like, what am I feeling right now? And the goal there is not, it's not that second part of like bringing in the actual tools. The goal is to just like develop a tighter connection, a tighter awareness to like what they're feeling, because I feel like injecting at the right moment, you know, and avoiding the feedback loop is like maybe the principal thing in order to actually make any change. So it's almost like more of a mindfulness thing than like an active experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that developing the awareness of the various mental states and the triggers for those mental states is foundational. And once you can do that, hopefully most of the time you can prevent them from even coming on. But in the cases that you can't, making sure that you have, something to interrupt that loop is really important.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe that's one area where our practices are different because I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to give adults too much credit and say that they're always emotionally well regulated. And I'm sure kids, you could probably give a lot of credit because a lot of kids are super well emotionally regulated. But it's like, it does seem to me that a lot of the people I work with, if we can get them to slow down, like I love the chalk bag cue because climbers are just like constantly grabbing their chalk bag. And so if you can get them to connect that habit of picking up the chalk bag with the habit of checking in with themselves, then you've kind of like tightened that connection. But I find that a lot of adults, like once you just get them to start paying attention to how they feel, they don't want to feel like angry at the boulder or frustrated or whatever. So they can come up with the tools if you can get them to like notice it happening. Do you find that same thing with the kids, or do you need to be a little bit more concrete with them in terms of the tools?
I definitely think that they develop the ability to kind of stop the loop before it happens by developing the awareness and the reflective practice. I do think that maybe this is, again, a difference between indoor and outdoor scenarios. With a competition, it's a one-shot thing, right? So the stakes are maybe a little bit higher than what your clients are experiencing on an outdoor day. Even if it's, you know, an important send-go or whatever, that rock is still going to be there, right? Whereas inside at the competition, their ability to qualify for nationals can come and go in an instant. And so I think maybe those emotions just get kind of riled up a little bit more intensely. Yeah,
I think that I'm with you on that logic. I do think that there's like there's an endpoint to that. And I'll give you a couple examples. I mean, I really like trying to flash boulders. And so that's an example where like the rock is still there, but there's been plenty of things that, you know, I really wanted to flash this thing. I didn't flash it. And in some cases, maybe I didn't even try it again, and I've never tried it again, and maybe I'll never go back there. And so it really was kind of a one-time deal. And I think the other place that it shows up is like this is true for long boulders, but it's definitely true for sport climbing, where like just you can just only give so many good tries in a day. The thing that the project I've been trying lately is it's just so long, and my capacity is what it is. And like, you know, I get maybe like 5 or 6 good tries in a day, but then I need a bunch of days off, right? And you can kind of do that math for a season and see like, well, yeah, it's definitely not the same as having one shot to qualify for nationals. That's an incredible amount of pressure. But a lot of the same mental framework stuff still seems to apply in the sense that, you know, it's this try, or I have to rest until next Wednesday, and then like I have to rest until the Sunday after that, and then it's April and it's like 70 degrees and there it goes, you know. Just it evaporates so fast, it seems like.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think that there's, again, like a lot of similarities between the indoor and the outdoor pressure. I think that one of maybe the biggest differences is the athletes that I work with are primarily youth climbers, and so their emotional regulation skills are still developing, and so maybe that's kind of one of the differences as well.
Yeah. What are like concrete tools that you would use in that situation if somebody was like having issues with, I want to get into expectations. I think that's something we're going to talk about a bunch. So let's just say like frustration or anxiety or those kind of feelings are like taking over. They're no longer in a good performance mindset, but they've picked up their chalk bag or whatever, and they've noticed that they're kind of spiraling. What would you have them, in their visualization, what would you have them do?
Yeah. So there's like two answers to this question. One is the visualization isn't something that I'm having them do in the moment. The visualization is something that I'm having them do ahead of time to practice what I like to call their fire drill. So the fire drill is like a set of actions that they are going to take in order to distract them and redirect them from the negative mindset or the frustration, et cetera, that they're experiencing. So they will use that imagery to practice those things. And those things could include, I have one athlete who simply like unscrews her water bottle and takes a sip. I have one who takes a step away from the boulder and sits down. So they're very basic actions, but they are action oriented. They're not things that are just happening in your mind, but they're replicable. So you could do them in any scenario. And they're just really short and sweet, because in the competition context, you only have a, limited amount of time before you can get back on the boulder, or before you have to get back on the boulder.
Yeah, so, I mean, this whole loop might be happening in like 10 seconds because they have 40 seconds left and they need to give another go or whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen it work really, really well for a lot of my athletes. They have their like small sequence of actions that they perform, and then they're able to kind of reset and get back on the climb. Gotcha.
Is breathing something that would ever show up in one of those fire drills?
Totally. Yeah. We do a couple of different breathwork protocols. I think like a lot of people currently, I'm pretty psyched on the physiological sigh. And my athletes like that as well. And so they'll use that both kind of within a round as well as in the chair while they're waiting between boulders.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something I was going to mention earlier, and I want to jump back to it now. So we've mostly been talking about like athletes who are trying to get into kind of a try hard state, maybe some execution pressure stuff. So I want to go all the way back to that and ask, have you had athletes where you have the opposite issue? Like they just come straight out in fifth gear all the time and they like can't have fun in practice. They can't like, downshift, which could show up in a comp, like in terms of not being able to like relax for a section that requires them to like stand on a slab or whatever. But even maybe just not being able to like chill out and practice and sit back with their friends. Is that something that you deal with too?
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't say necessarily in the context of like not being able to chill and sit down with their friends, but certainly being too up and having a difficulty down regulating in order to be able to do something like a delicate slab climb. And so something that I talk a lot about with the athletes that I coach and the clients that I work with is finding where your optimal zone of performance is, and being able to kind of identify that on a curve, and then figuring out what are all of the tools and skills that I have in my power to use to get me to that point. And a lot of the time it's actually going down. It's not up regulation, it's down regulation, because they're, wired and stressed all the time.
Okay. This is great because this comes to something else I wanted to ask you. I want to tell you about myself, and I want to tell you about one of my really close climbing partners. So for a really long time in climbing, I've had like a really good breathwork practice and like mantra that I use. I don't even really do the mantra that much anymore, but it started out with like breathing in, breathing out, and saying a mantra. And then that would like help me get into the zone to try really hard on a boulder or a route, right? And I could sit for 5 or even 10 minutes under the boulder, like chalked up, fully ready to go, and just sit there breathing until I feel like the time is right. And that actually helps me like feel calm and ready to give a really good effort. And you can kind of put that in opposition to a really good buddy of mine that I climb with, who it's almost the total opposite. Like if he sat there and breathed, he'll get so nervous that he can't do a good job, and if we're at the boulder with a bunch of people and he pulls on and everybody stops talking and starts watching him, it almost like messes with his mind. So if I'm climbing with this friend, like we'll just be having a casual conversation and he's like chalking up and moving towards the start of the boulder, and I just have to keep like talking and pretend like nothing's happening so he can like sort of sneak up on climbing this thing that's really challenging, and I can't get over how opposite those two approaches are. Is that something that you understand or you can provide any insight on?
Yeah, totally. I think that meditation works for people, and I would kind of liken what you're doing to a type of meditation. I think that works really well for people who have maybe a relatively quiet mind to begin with and can kind of like find peace in that quiet. But I think for anyone who has or would consider themselves to experience a lot of anxiety or racing thoughts, that quiet just like leaves the door open for all of those thoughts to rush in. And so someone who struggles with that, I would consider myself to be more of an anxious-minded person. They'll typically function much better with some sort of action-oriented thing where they're being able to distract from what's going on in their mind, getting completely out of the mind and into the body. So I think a typical recommendation for like a mindfulness practice for someone who is more anxious is to journal, because it is more action-oriented than to meditate, which would better suit someone who has maybe a quieter mind.
Gotcha. I wouldn't accuse myself of having a quiet mind, but I think I know what you mean. I think I've been doing that so long that it's almost like a muscle that I've built up, and I've climbed alone a lot for a really long time. And so I think there was a lot of just not distracting environments where I could like take as long as I needed, because for sure it's way harder for me to do that if I'm climbing with 10 people than if I'm climbing with like a good friend who sees me do that and they just shut up because they know what I'm doing, But if I'm climbing with a bunch of strangers who are like, hey, how do you grab this hold, while I'm like trying to relax, and get ready, it's obviously a little bit more convoluted.
I wonder if it's also context dependent, right? Like maybe that type of quiet meditation in the context of climbing would work really well for you, but maybe not in other contexts.
Yeah. I'm not sure. It's something that I've like played with, but I think and maybe other people can relate to this in terms of their performance, but when it's something really hard and I really care about doing it, and like I was saying earlier, the tries feel very limited in a season or in my life at this point, like I'm not very willing to experiment a lot. Like I'm happy to experiment at like things that are a little easier than my max or things that I feel like will take me a few days or whatever. But if it's like really, really hard for me, I'm kind of like, well, this is what's worked for me in the past, so I'm going to like cling to what feels like a, port in a storm, basically.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, but there's also like what got you here won't get you there, So sometimes I wonder like if I should be branching out a little bit more. That's the problem with aphorisms. You can use them to back up like any argument you want, basically. I guess my last thing on the execution pressure is like flashing specifically. Do you put a lot of pressure on the first go with your athletes, or is it just like our job is to get it done, and obviously the first go is great, but like keeping kind of a more open mindset? Or do you like do a lot of training of like, we're going to do this right now?
Well, first I'll say that I try not to put any extra pressure on them at all, because they put plenty on themselves. Do I focus on the flash go? Certainly. I think that in the competition context, it can oftentimes matter. Your attempts can matter, particularly in sport season. That is that's all you get.
Yeah.
So definitely helping them kind of develop their tactical strategies and making sure they're setting themselves up for success for that best first go is definitely an emphasis in my programming. Because I think that, if the first go can be the best go, then you're kind of set. But if you have to learn from your first go, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but it definitely puts you back a couple steps.
The way you phrase that, I mean, this is a perfect example of why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I had to think about what you said in terms of like, if you didn't do it on your first try, if you failed, basically, right? If I'm being like blunt about it, but the way you phrased it was if you had to learn from your first try. And I think that's such a good example of like the specificity of language and how important it is to something like not putting too much pressure on your kids because they already put enough pressure on themselves, right?
Yeah.
That's such a careful way to phrase that. It's really well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that bouldering in particular really excites me as a discipline because it is this model where you get to learn from your mistakes and you get to apply that learning in real time. And that just really aligns with my values. I think that's really, really cool. And I think that developing the skill to be able to kind of synthesize everything all in one go is also a very exciting and, I don't know, climactic expression of effort.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like effort and maybe curiosity would be two of like the paramount values that I feel like you have to express in order to be a really good boulderer. And actually the idea of learning from each try and really treating the tries more like a fact-finding mission, or like a, because I'm a huge fan of the idea of like gathering as much information as you can from the ground.
Totally.
Even post flash try. I mean, I think that if people took their shoes off more often, they'd probably be better boulderers in most cases. It's just we get so sucked into like constantly physically engaging with it because it's this very clear way to like, you're almost increasing the bandwidth of the information that you're getting from the rock, right? So it's like when you're looking at it, you have like so much bandwidth of how much you're learning. When you pull on, you get this like much wider amount of bandwidth, but you pay skin and energy for that privilege.
Yeah.
And that's maybe a little different than I guess in the competition where it's like you're more limited by time really than anything.
Yeah, you're limited by time. I mean, you have to consider your skin for sure. If you have, a coordination move on fiberglass on your first boulder, and you give it 36 attempts in 4 minutes, and then you still have 3 more boulders, like, good luck. But yeah, I think that for me, the key with the learning piece, like learning from your attempts versus your flash goes, is the flash go should not be an experiment. If the flash go is an experiment, you're giving up an attempt, right?
Yeah.
Your flash go, you should be fully prepared to give your best attempt possible, whether that means, making sure you brush, knowing the sequence that you're going to use, or committing to a sequence, even if you aren't certain. And then should you need to try again, making sure you apply whatever learnings you got from that attempt. But the tentative kind of like, I'm just going to feel this out, that's something that I try to discourage from the clients that I work with, because
for sure
you're really not getting any valuable information from an attempt like that.
For sure. And it's I think it makes sense because it maybe shunts some of the pressure or shunts some of the like emotional intensity of that first attempt, which in an environment where you have plenty of tries and plenty of energy and you're just being low key about it is fine. But as soon as you have like pressure or you're limited on energy or anything like that, you kind of have to deal with those emotions so you can get as much information out of the attempt as possible. And like with my clients, if we're trying to work on flashing, I mean, I couldn't tell you the number of people that I've worked with who have just never worked on flashing. And when we like really dedicate some energy to working on flashing, they improve at red pointing. And like, to me, a really hard flash attempt and a really hard red point attempt are not that different.
Yeah.
Like you should be, we can get into video beta. That's a whole other thing we could talk about, but like you should be able to look at something for long enough to come up with a really good plan. And if you keep looking at it for longer and longer and longer, you're going to notice cracks in that plan and address them the same as you would by trying the boulder with a red point. I think that takes a certain amount of climbing IQ, but it also just takes a lot of patience. And I think that's the part that anybody can probably tackle. And then you just are left with the pressure, but the pressure is not really that much different between a flash and a red point, like I said, because eventually your tries are so limited either way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Do you have tools that you use or like drills that you use or anything to try to like develop curiosity in your clients? Because I feel like that plays a huge role in their willingness to treat it as that like, what was the way you phrase it? Like willingness to treat their failed flash attempt as something they learned from rather than a failure, which I keep going back to that word.
Yeah, definitely. some of the things that I'll do is, have the athletes try a boulder a few different ways. I think that can kind of spur some creativity. But I think what my athletes like the most is making up their own climbs. So I just assign makeups in their programming, and have them maybe like there's some scaffolding around them, like do a makeup with this type of move in it, or with, this other type of move in it. And try and kind of use these different constraints or limitations to help you explore different types of movement.
That's great. Yeah, I set, when I climb on, right now I'm climbing on a friend's spray wall as like my main training board, and hopefully I'll have a board here sooner than later, but almost every time I climb on that board, I set a bunch of problems. It's like the first thing I do in the day. And like one of my favorite ways to set problems is I just like scan the board for like orphan holds, like, where are the holds that we like put on, and then they were on one climb like 6 months ago and they've never been used again. And I'll try to like connect several of those holds, because it just feels like that's a chance for me to be creative with it in a way that maybe I've been like neglecting.
I love that. Yeah. At nationals last year, I was working with an athlete and she had another coach with her. And the way that he was warming her up, I really liked. He would, on the spray wall, he would pick a hold, or he would have her pick a hold. He would say, pick a hold that you want to use in this makeup. And then he would kind of design a makeup around that hold. And I just thought that was a really interesting way to get a little bit more creative.
Yeah, that's cool. And then they have, you kind of get some buy-in from the athlete in terms of like, you're not just forcing them to do the thing that you think is, they're not just eating spinach for every meal, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. All right. I want to go back to talking about expectations, which I feel like there's a whole lot that we can cover here. I guess we can maybe frame it because we've been talking about flashing. So you kind of mentioned earlier in this conversation, the idea of athletes having an experience in the competition or in some performance, and maybe it wasn't the experience they expected. And I think it was interesting because when you said that, you phrased it as like they were realizing they're not as good as they thought was the expectation, or that was like the framing. They were expecting themselves to do so well, instead of maybe thinking about like the boulder being harder than they expect, which is usually what I jump to if I like see a video of something and think it looks cool and go on a trip and then try it and I'm like, wow, this is way harder than I thought it was going to be. That's kind of where my expectations seep in. And I think with my clients, maybe what they struggle with the most is more like get a lot of should language and a lot of like, I should be able to do this many problems of this grade in a season or whatever, or in a session or something like that. Or even a thing that I'll notice a lot is like, if somebody's 5'4", they might say like, well, I follow this other person and they climbed this problem and they're 5'4", therefore I should be able to climb this problem.
Yeah.
Is that something that you work with your clients on? Is that something that comes up, that kind of self-talk?
All the time. Yeah. Yeah. All the time. It, it can span anything from the social comparative self-talk of, well, like, so-and-so did it and I'm about the same ability level as them. And so I should be able to do it. To kind of what I was describing earlier is, I find, I'm so sorry.
I'm just, your cat is pretzeling your headphone cord right now in a pretty amazing cat way.
Yeah.
Classic
she's
cat behavior.
catting pretty hard. Cat, go over there. One of the experiences that I think a lot of my athletes have is they'll have some definition of who they are as a climber, right? Like I'm a slab climber, right? I'm like a wicked slab, just, I don't know, beast, whatever. And then they'll get on a slab climb at a competition and they'll not do well. And that's kind of when they'll be like, well, shit, like if I couldn't do the slab, then I'm not as prepared as I thought I was for this competition. And there's no chance I'm going to be able to do all these other boulders that are of the style that I don't consider myself to be as good at. So I think this like personal narrative, these core beliefs that you have about yourselves can really define those expectations, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the gap between reality and those expectations.
So then to you, is the next logical step to like help them work on their self-beliefs? Yeah.
So I think that there's like, I always describe it as there being two layers to the process that I take clients through. There are the kind of like fast acting tools and skills that I can give you, like an albuterol inhaler, for example, right?
Sure.
And, that's the breath work and the imagery and maybe the self-talk, right? And then there's the more deep stuff, which is examining those core beliefs and your definitions of success and the core reasons why you engage in this type of climbing to begin with. And this kind of detective work for themselves of really understanding what are the cognitive and behavioral patterns that I have that are pigeonholing me or are stopping me from making the progress that I want to see. And what are the patterns that I have that are more adaptive and productive?
Yeah, like empowering you. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, and I really like the idea of using that as like a jump off point for journaling, just something you've mentioned a few times, because I think that's the kind of thing where that stuff does come up in conversations with my clients for sure, but maybe it's something that people would be more comfortable or like most comfortable just keeping to themselves and just sort of saying like, okay, like which things are serving me and which things do I really need to let go of? I know for myself, like I'm 38 years old. I'm, not entirely, but largely a boulderer. And for, 5+ years, I've been like struggling with the idea of getting older as a boulderer. And like, if I could go back 5 years, I would just be like, hey man, when you're 38, you're still going to be struggling with these same ideas. So why not just like wait 5+ years and like worry about it then? And I'm sure I can apply that same logic now and like worry about it when I'm 43 because things are going fine, So clearly that's like a self-belief that is not as empowering as maybe I would wish for it to be,
Yeah, and kind of examining how do those beliefs impact the way you engage with climbing, right? The way you engage with your training, the way you engage with the moments of performance that are important to you. I think a lot of that can be really invisible if you don't take the time to dig a little bit deeper and examine all of those different impacts and effects.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as far as that specific self-belief that I have, there are also a lot of benefits of like considering yourself as being, getting older, and because, it just makes me make probably smarter decisions, not all the time, but
totally.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Every once in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I will say is like, I think I've done a really good job of getting away from the sort of should based language with my own performance and like treating things more as like it's my life and my lifestyle and trying to be very process driven. So like, as an example, if I go out to try a project, like I will always set an expectation for the session. I'm very clear with myself. It almost always comes with while I'm driving is like when I'm thinking about it. And the harder the thing is that I'm trying, the more likely that expectation is going to be something very abstract, something that I feel very sure I can kind of feel that I've checked it off when I'm driving home, but again, in an abstract sense, right? So not something outcome oriented. And I wouldn't even go so far as to be like, I'm going to link these moves today, or I'm going to, I might focus on a move, but I'm not like, I need to do this link today, or I should be able to like get to the, to this high point or whatever from this point on the boulder. I try to avoid that kind of stuff, but I think that there's a lot of people who they're very attached to like the productive side of climbing or like the outcome side of climbing. And that's like part of their value system for the sport.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for how to reframe expectations that are very outcome driven for people who struggle with that kind of like should language or like heavy outcome expectations of themselves?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that outcomes are super important, right? I think that they provide really potent fuel and motivation for all of the process oriented things that happen along the way in service of that outcome, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's important for them to feel empowered in those outcome goals. I think that one process that I take my clients through is we talk about our outcome goals in the beginning of a performance season, whether that's indoors or outdoors. And these goals are kind of like, okay, I'm going to draw an analogy here that is maybe going to feel a little bit goofy, but I'm going to go for it. Okay.
I'm here for it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I have started to see outcome goals as similar to the moon, right? So the moon is there. It exists. It's big. It's bright. It's beautiful. It hangs above us all the time. And we don't need to look at it to know that it's there. And we don't need to look at it to feel its influence, right? Like the moon has effects on the tide and other things, right? Similar to goals, your outcome goals, they are big and grand and maybe dreamlike. And they impact our day-to-day. They impact our motivations. They impact our engagement with climbing, our engagement with other things, our moods, right? But if we spend all of our time staring up at the moon while we're walking around, we're going to trip and fall on our face. Likewise, if you spend your whole day thinking about your outcome goals and not the process goals that are in service of that outcome, you're going to fall flat every single time.
Yeah.
And so that is one way that I kind of contextualize the difference between an outcome goal and process-oriented goals. And then along with that, something that I've started to do with my clients is I make these Google forms. And there's like pre-performance intention forms that they fill out. And depending on what type of performance they're going for, the questions on the form will be a little bit different. But the gist is, what are the hidden expectations you have going into this performance? And how might those hidden expectations impact your ability to engage in a productive way? And then what would you like to be focused on during this performance? And so I'll usually give them kind of a list of different things like emotional regulation or honing their tactics or learning a new skill, but something very process oriented and experiential. And then, what's one metric of success that you can use at the end of the day that's not outcomes related, that, if you do this thing, you'll feel proud.
Yeah. And that gives them something they can look at while they're walking, that they're like less likely to trip over themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's such a great analogy. I don't think it's goofy at all, by the way. And it's, to me, that really reminds me of like how I feel about tick lists, which is I find that a lot of people just, when they're writing tick lists, especially for a short trip, they're sort of just transposing the guidebook onto their notes app or onto a page on a notebook or something. And they put so many things on the tick list that it's like, it hasn't really given them any new information. And I think part of that is just an availability bias thing. Like we tend to sort of, when people come visit where I live, Leavenworth, like everybody goes and does like Busted, and everybody goes and does like the super popular boulders, right? And I think I have a hard time coming up with them because I'm almost like disdainful now, because I've climbed here for so long and lived here for a while, and like there's so many good things to do that if you just made a list of the ones that you knew, you're sort of selling yourself short, right? You're almost like you're making the moon to be the things that are going to be the most kind of uninteresting. And I know that's like a different point than the one that you were trying to make, but for me, over the last I guess it's been since 2021, so 4 years since I like really made a tick list for a season or even for a trip, because now I've kind of realized like you were saying, like you're not going to forget that the moon is in the sky, right? And that's kind of how I feel about my projects now. Like if I go to a party and somebody's like, hey, what are you going to try this spring? Like I have to think about it for a second, but I have a clear answer. I'm not going to rattle off 20 things. And that's, I think, a much more like pure sort of motivation. It did take me, I had to climb for a really long time before I had a clear enough sense of what I wanted out of climbing to be able to answer those questions, But I think that's, Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, I think that maybe part of the draw or the motivation for those tick lists is just like earning status. People feel like they need to earn status in order to be like a valid part of the community. Yeah.
When we hopped on for the call, you asked if there was anything that had like sprung to mind as stuff we might talk about. And I was reading this paper this morning. I haven't finished it yet, but it's a philosophy paper about this concept called value capture. Because I listened to this other psychology podcast that's really cool, and they were talking about it on there. And the idea of value capture is basically like, it's like applied Goodhart's law. So basically, like when you have something that you can measure, it starts to become the value, and you start to lose the value that you had for the original thing. Mm-hmm. So like a good example would be like a Fitbit is a great tool for somebody who isn't really into exercising, because it's going to get them to like get up and take steps. But if somebody already values going for walks, and then they get a Fitbit and they start going for walks just to take steps. And they're no longer like going for a walk in a nice neighborhood or like, going for a walk in like a trail that's harder to get to, because then they would have to drive and they can't get as many steps. They start to value the steps instead of the original thing that they liked doing. And I was like listening to them and reading this paper, and I was like, I can't believe how strongly this relates back to climbing. I feel like that's what the tick list thing really is, and what all the like video beta, and I think Kaya is a great app. I'm not trying to talk shit on Kaya, but that is for sure what Kaya is like value capture for, people who love this sport and want to engage with it in a more deep way, and kind of accidentally wind up losing sight of like the most important part of the sport because they get captured.
Yeah. I mean, I know for myself, I can't keep track of anything, and not because I'm unorganized. I'm incredibly organized, but if I like use metrics to keep track of my workouts or how many books I'm reading, I lose the love for the thing that I'm doing. And so I have to be really intentional with, how I monitor progress, because otherwise I get totally stuck into that value capture.
I think it's really interesting, and like I haven't been taking my logbook very seriously for a little while, and I haven't been posting very much video beta for a little while. And I think it's because at some point, maybe last year, I think it's because I started coaching and posting on social media a lot more and stuff. It started to change the way I interact with some of that stuff. But I just got really cynical about the like commodification, and I knew about it before. I was aware of it before, but it hadn't hit me just how much, as someone who other people might view as a role model, which is deeply disturbing to me, but I know that it's still, true in some ways, that I was presenting that to people as something that I do, and,
right.
And I think at some point I was like, well, I didn't mind doing it, even if I was like slightly value captured by it. I don't think that it had like, I climb low ball choss. I'll drive way out of my way to like put up a first ascent that nobody's ever going to repeat again. Like I love all that shit about climbing. So I'm not super worried about the green check mark, like polluting my climbing life, but I don't like the idea that I would be presenting to other people an idealized idea of climbing, that I think that that's like a really good way to engage with the sport, if that makes sense. And that started to like change me a little bit.
Totally. I think that's a value that I totally share with you. I'm so conscious and thoughtful about how I engage with my coaching, is internalized or taken by other climbers, coaches, athletes, because I do think that whether we like it or not, at a certain point, we do become, I don't know. I don't know what word is the right word to use without sounding incredibly pompous, but like figureheads in a way, right? Like people listen.
Yeah.
And if they're going to be listening to me, I want to be making sure that the things that I say are in line with my values.
Yeah, totally. I mean, especially for you, because value systems are like, I think I read something that value systems are like largely shaped by like age 6, and then what's left, most of it is determined by age 20. And like the chance of making a significant shift in your values after age 20 is like very, very small. So you're having a huge impact in those kids' lives. And I'm just trying to like nudge people slightly. So I think figurehead is like a totally appropriate word. Does the idea of value capture hold any, I want to say hold any value. Does the idea of value capture apply in your mind to climbing? Do you find that kids get captured by like their, ranking or like how they do in the comps instead of their performance and things like that? Is that something you have to combat?
100%, 100 million%. Yeah. Yeah. It's really difficult to get them to divorce how they feel about their actual performance from how they ended up on the rankings. Right. I think, that's a big battle that I have to navigate with them, because, with this idea of success and outcomes versus process, the simple fact is that while my clients and I might be able to develop a really thoughtful definition of success that is broad and, complex, the definition of success at a USA climbing competition is to win, right? Like that's kind of baked into the cake of a competitive sport. And And so as much as the things that I'm saying, I believe in them and they are true, and I hope become internalized by the athletes that I work with. The other thing is also true, right? That rankings matter and placements matter. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. Something that I try to do to combat that is after a performance, if a kid or an athlete is done with a competition, before they are allowed to engage with the results, the rankings, or even watch the rest of their competitors compete, I request that they go find a quiet space to process their own performance before they're able to compare it to anybody else. And so, again, there's another Google form for that, where they go through that process, and either they'll do the Google form or they'll do that processing with myself or with one of their peers. But I find that time a way for them to really reflect on how they did before they're integrating all this other information is really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. It lets them kind of come at it from like a less judgmental way, basically, because they don't have that, the lens of like, you feel like you did really well, but you got 6th place versus you feel like you did really well and you got 36th place or whatever. You're going to have such a hard time viewing that like, transparently, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. I mean, I guess I've been thinking about this concept of loss aversion a lot lately. And loss aversion is like the idea that finding $10 in the street gives you like so many units of pleasure, but losing $10 like takes away way more units of pleasure, right? So I can't help but relate that back to climbing and the idea that like if I go out to climb on something that I like expect to send, I'm gonna feel like so good that I did it, but I'm not gonna feel that good because I like expected to send it. But if I don't do it, I'm gonna feel so bad by like an order of magnitude worse, basically. Even if it's the same thing really either way. And I could totally see it being that way with like competing, where if they feel good about their performance, but other people just happen to perform even better, which is like totally outside of their control, it's going to mess with their ability to feel good about it. Yeah. That's super interesting. So for the expectations thing, there was like one little nit there that I wanted to come back to, which is, I guess we immediately got off towards like big picture outcome expectations, sort of like, sending projects or like completing problems in competition or like getting good results or whatever, the kind of moon size things.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious more about like, what about setting clear expectations for sessions? You did talk about like some process things that you'll have kids do. So like focusing on their tactics and things like that. But do you have kids where they struggle with just like feeling like they should send things in practice or feeling like they should do a certain amount of climbing in practice, and you're trying to get them off of that sort of that hedonic treadmill of like feeling like they need to complete more stuff?
Yeah. So I guess first I'll say, when I'm asking kids to come up with like a focal point for a practice, and this might sound super semantic and not important, but I like to use the word intention rather than expectation, because I just think that it produces like a more open-minded approach. So I guess that's like point A. And point B, can you actually repeat the question?
I mean, I let me see if I can sort of rephrase the question. And I love the idea of setting an intention instead of setting an expectation. I think that really makes a lot of sense. I think basically what I'm struggling with is like, sometimes people come to me and they're frustrated with their sessions because they're putting a lot of pressure on themselves to have every session be, some definition of successful, basically. Yeah. Right. And I think because, I've tried a bunch of different things, and some things work with some people and some things don't. One thing that I have found really effective for me, and one thing I've found effective for a lot of climbers, is just to set that intention of like, I'm going to try hard today, or I'm going to like focus on my footwork today, or I'm just going to like engage with my friends today and like have a good social session. It doesn't seem like that resonates with a lot of climbers, and I think it kind of, not with a lot. I think that doesn't resonate with some climbers. And I think that comes back to what you were saying about like, the outcomes do matter. Like, we do want to send stuff. We do want to feel good climbing. It's not like you can't just brush that aside really casually, right? So again, I'm not sure I'm really asking a question as much as just a curiosity.
No, I'm with you now. Yeah, I think that, one of the maybe fallacies that people get stuck with is this idea that they have to work hard. And I think people have a really narrow definition of what it means to work hard. And some of the things that fall under that definition are to leave a climbing session feeling really tired, to leave a climbing session with a certain amount of tops, or to leave a climbing session having climbed like a certain grade, right? And so I think it's a two-part answer. I think you have to redefine what success is for every given climbing session. And that's kind of the process of setting those intentions. And then I think you have to do some honest reflection on, do you need to work harder by virtue of pulling harder or getting more tired? Or do you need to do the work that is hard for you, which might mean redefining what success looks like in order to optimize for success farther down the road, rather than this very immediate gratification fixation that I think happens with a lot of people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Does that kind of tie into your idea that you mentioned of like conscious versus subconscious expectations? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, I think that if people are doing a better job of really untangling what they want out of a session before they start a session, it'll be easier to leave a session feeling satisfied.
Yeah, I think, and for the record, you said conscious versus subconscious expectations. I think that was something you said last time we talked when we were preparing for this. That's where my my habit or my tactic of always setting an expectation with myself before the session came from, is because if I don't set a clear goal for the day that's something abstract, like my goal for the day is going to be to like rage and give it 1,000% effort, and I just can't do that every day. It's just it's not a very effective practice. And so at some point I realized, like, all the sessions where I'm really frustrated, I tried hard and I gave it my best, I just didn't really have that much in the tank that day. And it's like not very fair. I guess the adage that people use is like, some days you get a shovel, some days you get a spoon, but your job is just to keep digging, and like, on those days where I got a spoon, I would be like really upset at the amount of dirt that I moved, but like, that's not your fault if you're digging with a spoon,
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I think redefining success and I think also just this idea of doing the work that's hard for you and not just like working hard.
Right. Yeah. Effort has to be pointed. It's kind of like a laser or something. It's like, it can't be broadly, doesn't really make any sense. Can't be broadly targeted.
And I think people are like really looking for the satisfaction of fatigue in order to cue them that they have worked hard.
Totally.
But that's just not how it works.
Well, totally. I mean, that comes back to technique, I think, too, like the actual movement of climbing. Like, I notice this all the time with people, especially climbing on a board, is like people expect climbing on a board to feel really hard. And so they make a lot of movements that are like not very, maybe not very like proactive or not very balanced. And then they are like reacting to those movements and like catching themselves or like letting their center of mass really swing out in a violent way. And like, sometimes that stuff is necessary on a board. It's not like you can climb on a board and always look like the old school French climbers from the 90s who just like never cut their feet. Like, there's going to be violent stuff on a board happening. But if you really tightly tie these ideas of like, climbing on a board should be violent, therefore when I'm violent on a board I've gotten a good outcome, like, you just become really inefficient,
Yeah.
Because you stop looking for those technical efficiencies that are so important, even with really aggressive climbing. So should we talk about focus? That was one of the areas that you also said that you wanted to talk about, and I don't have any questions ready for this one, so I guess I'm just kind of throwing it at you. But you said one of the things you're most interested in is having your clients focus on the right thing at the right time. So tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty simple, right? I think there's, in a given moment, in a given performance, there is a productive thing to be focused on and an unproductive thing to be focused on. And oftentimes, when there is high pressure or high stakes, it is really easy to focus on that unproductive thing, which oftentimes takes the form of worrying about the outcome or worrying about a past mistake. And that is just enough of like a detractor of your attention to pull away from all of the productive things that you could actually be doing in the moment to help you get closer to your goal.
Does this go back? Am I right to tie this back to the CBT thing again, or the idea of like becoming aware when we get stuck into those like unproductive kind of modes of thought?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I feel like that one, this idea is like really important for people who climb outside and like to climb on projects, because so much of hard projecting is like, as you get closer and you've put together more of the puzzle pieces, you just have to remain. It's very easy to get your attention pulled away to like the parts of the picture that you have filled in, and to not like stay laser focused on those like little pieces of the puzzle that you haven't figured out yet.
Yeah.
You know? And I think people get stuck in these loops of like climbing 70% of it and getting to the same spot, you know, and getting really frustrated with themselves, instead of like figuring out how to apply their attention to the right thing along the chain, or maybe it's something at that 70% mark that they're really struggling with.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think you mentioned in our prep call how like watching video can kind of detract from that process, because they're maybe so focused on what another person is doing at that point in the climb that they aren't really engaged or cued into what they need to change about what they're doing on the climb.
Yeah, for sure. Is that even something that you struggle with when you mostly coach comp kids? Because I guess, you know, you probably review video, but it's got to be like, you know, you can never know the moves you're going to do in a competition, basically, right?
Yeah, you don't know in the competition, but a lot of my kids climb outside too. And so it definitely comes up in our practices, or, you know, when they're projecting climbs in the gym, thinking about how one person did it versus how they're going to do it. I have very disparate body types on my team. And so a lot of different tactics and strategies that have to go into optimizing for those body types.
Gotcha. When it comes to the like focusing on different things, is that something that's sort of like you come up with a technical goal or like a tactical goal for each client in terms of where they should focus their attention? Or do you have like general things that you like to have climbers focus on that you find to be productive kind of across the board?
I think it really depends on the scenario. And so again, it's very individual. And so what I'll do is I'll do like an intake with the climber of where is your focus right now? What are you currently focusing on in the moments when things aren't going so well for you? And then based on that, I will help them to redirect their attention to something productive. I think for some climbers, it can be really productive for them to focus on something climbing related that is going to get them closer to their goal, right? So maybe it's precision of footwork, or maybe it is more thorough route reading. But for some climbers, that will just freak them out more. If they're focused on trying to optimize their climbing performance, it can just get them in their heads more. And so for some climbers, I'll have them totally distract themselves, and I'll give them a Rubik's Cube, and they need to focus on playing with the Rubik's Cube until it is literally time for them to get on the wall. So it varies quite a lot based on the temperament of the kid.
Interesting. And that's, can you clarify for me, like you're having them distract themselves in like a practice situation? Because obviously in a comp, they're gonna be like, or are you suggesting that they distract themselves like from the target, like while they're actually up there and they have their 5 minutes or whatever?
So, are you familiar with like how comps work? They have like a chair time where they're like in a chair
you should just briefly explain it just in case.
Right. Cool. So at a competition, a bouldering competition, you have 4 minutes to climb and then 4 minutes to rest and then 4 minutes to climb. And you do that for 4 different climbs. So during those 4 minutes of rest, you're sitting in chair facing away from the climbs, and you're just looking at the audience and the audience's reactions to all of the climbing that's happening behind you. So it's a pretty like high stimulation environment and can be really, really nerve wracking. And so in that chair time, I do recommend for them to have something that's going to help keep them focused on the right thing at the right time. And sometimes the right thing to focus on is just not the wrong thing to focus on.
Right.
And so I have an athlete who does friendship bracelets in the chair. I have someone who brings a Rubik's Cube. I have some clients who bring books. I encourage every single one of my clients to have music in their ears, because the generation that I work with, music is a really big part of their life. And it's something that can be heavily impactful and distracting for them.
Yeah.
And then I have some kids who are a little bit less anxious by nature, and they can kind of engage in what they want to be doing for the next climb. And so I'll have them focus on those things.
Right. Yeah. The roar of the crowd or whatever just doesn't get to them the same as it does to some other kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's on such a clear cadence. And I think that's really fascinating, because for people that I work with who are maybe having issues like getting unfocused or getting frustrated or whatever, I know I mentioned the like check-in idea, but another thing that is really effective for me and that I've had a ton of other people do too is to just put distance between themselves and the thing that they're, working on.
Yeah.
And, to like go for a walk or to just like physically get away from the boulder or the route, I think is really, really helpful. And that's like it's not an option in a competition. You can't just like,
leave.
Get up from your chair and leave or like, I know it's my 4 minutes, but I'm just going to like go for a walk around it's like not something that you can do, which makes it so challenging because you just can't disconnect in that time.
Yeah, you really have to go inside yourself to disconnect. But I can also imagine that it could be beneficial in the context of outdoor climbing for the climbers to have like a really well thought out plan of what they're going to do at every given point of their session, right? When they're going to brush, when they're going to have a snack, when they're going to talk about beta with their friends, when they're going to look at beta videos. And then in the case of needing to like cool off or move through frustration, how they're going to do that, and kind of having a blueprint for those times.
Yeah, I feel like that visualization piece, I mean, that's such a I don't know, broad or abstract way to use visualization. I think I'm very interested in visualization as like a movement solving practice and an emotional management practice and all that kind of stuff with the stuff that comes up while you're climbing. But the idea of using visualization, more for like what's going to happen when you're off the wall, or more for like how your day is going to go and stuff, I think that's a really interesting application of it that probably has a lot of merit for outdoor climbers.
I use it all the time in my day-to-day life.
I've kind of done a similar thing to that when I'm like going on a trip, especially if I'm like camping or staying in my truck, because I just, I used to do that stuff all the time. And so it would just always be back when I had a van, it would just be in the van or it would be in the truck, but I don't do it so much anymore. So I kind of have to be like, okay, I'm going to wake up, which means I need my sleeping bag and my pad, and I'm going to make coffee, which means I need my stove and my fuel. And like, that's like my way of coming up with my packing list, is kind of like visualize the day. So I guess it's not that different than doing that for a climbing day, really. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah. The power of the mind to sort of predict the problems that we're going to face later on, I guess. It's pretty potent.
And the trouble you get yourself into when you try to predict with not enough information.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's never perfect. I think that's like what's so interesting about visualization is like people maybe underestimate the utility that it can have, even when you don't know what moves you're going to do, or even when you don't have really any information about the thing that you're going to climb. And I remember the who's the guy that won nationals, bouldering nationals?
Vail Everett.
Yeah, Vail Everett. I remember reading his post where he was saying like that he had clearly visualized himself, how he was going to feel and topping out all the boulders and just like feeling unstoppable and like feeling really, good, and like he could do all the moves and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, that's like such a mature level of athletic visualization to have when you remember that like he had no idea what the moves were that he was going to be doing, right? It's everything else that he had so dialed.
Yeah, I think, I was actually talking with a client about that post that he made, and my client was like, what did he mean that he visualized it? And obviously I didn't communicate with Vail about it, but my take on it is it's more about visualizing who is the version of yourself that is able to achieve those goals, and where is the gap between the current version of yourself and that version of yourself, and how do you close that gap? And I think that's a nice concrete way to think about those types of visualizations.
Yeah, it's almost like moving into self-actualization or affirmations. Yeah, it's almost like affirmations at that point, which I think is super interesting. I think one side of visualization, and this is actually closer to like motor imagery. I don't think this has been like studied very intensely, but I'm really interested in visualization as like a tactile kind of experience. So like thinking about what holds are going to feel like and thinking about like where the tension is going to be in my body. Do you practice that kind of visualization?
Yeah, totally. That's part of the route reading process that I encourage with all of my athletes is, taking it just a step beyond the visual and trying to integrate as many senses as possible, particularly with feeling where the tension is going to be in your body. I find that to be very, very impactful.
That's been a really tricky thing for me to like explain to people and like get people on board with, is like kind of practicing how things are going to feel. You almost need to like come up with, you just be on the ground and like come up with a guess and then try it and then feel what it feels like on the wall and then come back down and then like come up with another guess and then try it again and sort of like keep going through that experience, which I guess you wouldn't have in a comp, it's like a higher stakes, but you can definitely see, clients kind of dancing it out. And I don't just mean like the sequence, but like actually physically moving on the ground. I always feel a little bit of like kinship or something when I see them do that. I'm like, oh yeah, that feels more like what I feel like I need to do.
I have an athlete who got on his back to read a route at divisionals at one of our competitions this year.
Awesome.
And I was like, hell yeah, you are integrating. I love it.
For a boulder?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I feel like I need to do that for sport routes now because the walls are so tall in all the gyms.
Yes. Yeah, I know. My neck is always like messed up during sport season. But yeah, that type of imagery and visualization is also really awesome.
Yeah, it has a lot of value for sure. I feel like the first person and the third person get like all the media for some reason, but I feel like that tactile element of visualization, and maybe motor imagery is a better word to use for that piece for sure, because it's so clearly tied to the motor system. But I feel like that gets short shrift. I feel like that should be something people think about more. So pay attention to how it feels, I guess.
Totally.
I guess I want to close with like a couple clear takeaways for people. I feel like we've talked about a lot of high level stuff, and just in case people are listening to this, and I know we covered a lot of like abstract wooey stuff, but if somebody's an outdoor climber and they're really just, they're doing the moves, they're climbing the problems, they're trying to send stuff, but they're sort of new to like the whole mindset side of things. Do you have any clear takeaways or starting points for people who might be newer to thinking about climbing this way?
Yeah, I think journal, and use a journal to build an awareness of what are the current cognitive and behavioral patterns that are both supporting you and making things more difficult for you. And so that might still seem a little bit abstract, but I think it really is a little bit of detective work to figure out. I think a lot of people feel like their good days and their bad days are really random, and they can't really differentiate between why they have a good day here and a bad day there. And it's rarely random. It's oftentimes just not paying attention to the right things at the right time. And so making sure you're taking stock of, okay, I had a really great day today. I felt really good. Ask yourself why. What were all of the contributing factors in your environment and the days leading up to that really good day that you can control for in the future?
I have the idea of like internal and external condies as being like, two axes of a grid. And when the internal and external condies are both hitting, that's like, those are the great days, and like most of the time one or the other is not really going to be ideal. And it behooves any climber to learn to notice both of those things for sure. Totally. And get good at both of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think building an awareness of the things that are inside your control, the things that you can directly and immediately impact in your process, and trying to funnel most of your attention to those things, and redirect away from the things that you can't impact, like the weather or, your friend sending before you, or, you not being able to climb the climb in the same way that the person on the video did.
Dichotomy of control. Yeah, you can't can't control all of it. I think that's good advice. Any other tips for people starting out with their mindset work?
Yeah, I think the next step after awareness is intention. And so coming up with, where you want to be and what you're willing to do to get there. And then how do you set up small systems along the way in order to optimize for that long-term goal?
All right. This might be a hard one. I'm putting you on the spot, so think about it if you need to. What's one piece of advice that you would give yourself when you were just starting out as a climbing coach?
As a climbing coach?
Yeah. Was climber the first thing that sprung to mind?
I assumed that that's what you were going to ask me. Okay. But yeah, as a climbing coach, this is like advice to my old self.
Yeah. I'm just curious, like, where your mind has changed or what things you've learned that you didn't expect,
Yeah. Okay. I think the biggest thing that I've changed my mind on since I became a climbing coach, since I started coaching climbing, is how important the outcome is, and how much more it should be valued than I was originally valuing it at. I think that comes from this transition from competitive gymnastics to competitive climbing. I really wanted to shed all of the high performance expectations from my coaching practice. And I think I just swung the pendulum a little bit too far, and realized that in the process of doing that, I kind of like disenfranchised a lot of my clients who were like, no, but I want to win.
Yeah.
And by saying that winning doesn't matter, you're, invalidating the things that are important to them. And so I think I've found a way to really connect with the aspects of winning or of success or of outcomes that like are really vulnerable and beautiful and challenging, and I think honorable things to strive towards.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think the interesting part for me as someone who's very committed to like being a high level amateur climber, at least for as long as possible, is like in my coaching experience, I want to push people as hard as I can, and I really want to see them achieve greatness. And I want to apply a little bit of pressure to those scenarios and have them know, like, look, we're going to like try really hard to get this. I know it's important to you, and we'll be compassionate in the times when you can't give it your all, but like, let's fucking try hard,
Yeah.
But in my own climbing, I've almost like pulled back from that to a significant extent. And it goes back to something you kind of mentioned earlier in the podcast, which is like, it's more of a self-identity journey that I'm interested in. Like, I don't know if I'll climb V13 or V14. Like, I think those things are possible for me, but just because I know I can do them, it doesn't mean that I will, and it doesn't mean that I should necessarily. And I feel like since I started accepting that, my performance has improved, and maybe the pendulum for me will also swing back the other way. I'm not totally sure, but
yeah,
it feels like that self-compassion piece was really important because it allowed me to just say, like, you know what, like, if I have to rest 3 days in order to have another good session on this thing, then I'm going to rest 3 days. Like, because if I just keep hammering it and not resting enough because I'm so desperate to get the outcome, like, I'm not really doing myself any long-term favors. And I feel like that was an interesting development for me. So it's interesting that you have the same or inverted kind of coaching realization.
Totally.
What about as a climber? Did something spring to mind when you thought that was the question?
Yeah, I think that recently what I've realized is, I think a coping mechanism of mine to I like not face the challenges in my climbing or in my life is to focus really heavily on the work that I do and solving other people's problems. And I think it just clicked for me, like literally in the last month or so, that, I've kind of been making excuses for myself that, like, I don't focus on my climbing because I'm so focused on other people's climbing. And I'm realizing that's an escape. That's not I'm like not striving towards something in that process. I am running from something in that process. And so, deciding to invest in myself or to bet on myself in a way that maybe I haven't in the past. If I decide that I have climbing goals, to like actually pursue them.
Yeah, hell yeah. And like you said, I mean, you're a hero to a lot of these kids, I'm sure, and like an idol to them in a way. So like, if you give it your everything and you try really hard, like that's gonna mean something to them, regardless of what happens in your actual, attempts to do whatever the thing is that you're trying to do. They're gonna notice that you're putting that effort in, which is cool. That sure makes me feel better. That I'm like, if I just do my best and people see me doing my best, like that's gonna count for something to them, and that's pretty cool. It takes some pressure off for sure.
Totally. Yeah. And I think like divorcing this idea of like pursuing my own climbing is selfish. I think that's kind of where I get hung up, and it is not. Yeah.
Mine is probably a little bit selfish, but I'm okay with it. I'm just like that.
And we should all have pursuits that are for ourselves, right? So
yeah, totally.
It's okay.
Yeah. Well, cool, Zoe. This has been fun. Any other ideas or remarks or things that we didn't cover?
Let me look at my notes really quick.
Sorry if you can hear my dog snoring in the background.
Oh, I couldn't, but I wish I could. Yeah, no, I think we covered everything. That was awesome. Super fun to chat with you about all this stuff.
All right, Zoe, how can people work with you on their mental performance?
They can email me at zoe@sayettacoaching.com or visit my website, sayettacoaching.com, and they can book sessions through there.
Awesome. And I will leave a link to that in the podcast show notes, and people can find more on there. And you're on Instagram. What's your Instagram handle?
I think it's sayetta.coaching.
Make sure that's in the show notes as well, and people can find you on there.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse.
Cool. Thanks so much, Zoe.
Yeah.